Chapter 1. You don't arrive at this perspective angry. That's the part people misunderstand. Anger is loud and sloppy. This comes from watching the same pattern repeat so many times that emotion gives up and observation takes over. You start noticing how predictable things are when you stop moralizing them and start reading incentives. You notice how behavior follows reward. You notice how people become exactly what their environment trains them to be. And once you see that clearly, you stop asking why and start asking how it was always going to end this way. When I say think like Machiavelli, I'm not talking about manipulation. I'm talking about removing sentiment from analysis. Machiavelli wasn't cruel for sport. He was precise about power. He understood that people respond to what is rewarded and avoid what is punished, and that most chaos comes from pretending otherwise. Once you look at dating, relationships, and gender dynamics through that lens, a lot of things that used to feel confusing suddenly feel obvious. Not good, not bad, just obvious. You've probably had moments where you thought, how does someone act like this and still feel justified? How does someone do something clearly destructive and walk away without reflection? How does someone receive generosity and respond with entitlement instead of gratitude? And at first, you personalize it. You think it's about you, about your effort, about what you failed to do. But the longer you live, the more you realize it's not personal at all. It's systemic. It's learned behavior reinforced over time by incentives that never corrected course. Think about what happens to any human being who is given constant passes with no consequences, not once or twice, consistently, over years. Imagine being told implicitly and explicitly that your emotions excuse your behavior, that your tears override facts, that someone else will step in to defend you even when you're wrong, that attention arrives without effort, that desire shows up without contribution, that mistakes don't cost you much, if anything. You don't need to be evil to become disconnected from reality under those conditions. You just need to be human. This isn't a gendered moral failing. It's an incentive problem. Anyone raised without accountability becomes distorted. We see it with spoiled children. We see it with unchecked leaders. We see it with anyone insulated from consequence long enough. Character isn't something you declare. It's something built through friction. And when friction is removed early and often, character atrophies. Not because someone chose to be bad, but because nothing required them to be better. You don't notice this distortion at first because it doesn't announce itself as cruelty. It shows up as entitlement, as confusion when things don't go their way, as outrage when expectations aren't met, as an inability to self-correct. And because the environment keeps rewarding the same behavior, there's no internal reason to stop. From the outside, it looks irrational. From the inside, it feels normal. That's the danger of unearned validation. It doesn't feel corrupting while it's happening. It feels affirming. You can see how early this conditioning starts if you pay attention. Certain behaviors are discouraged in boys early through correction, discipline, and consequence. Certain behaviors are excused in girls through protection, sympathy, and indulgence. Not always maliciously, often lovingly. Parents want to protect. Teachers want to nurture. Society wants to be kind. But kindness without balance becomes distortion. When one group is shielded from feedback while another is shaped by it, you don't get equality. You get divergence. Over time, that divergence widens. Attention becomes currency. Sympathy becomes leverage. Desire becomes insulation. And when those things are abundant and unconditional, they stop being appreciated. They become expected. You don't cherish what you never had to earn. You don't protect what you believe is infinite. And that belief, that attention and accommodation will always be there. Changes how someone treats others, not consciously, structurally. This is where men get confused because they experience the other side of that equation. Scarcity, correction, competition, delayed gratification, you learn early that nothing comes free. That mistakes cost you. That effort is required. That results matter. That nobody is coming to rescue you if you're wrong. That difference in conditioning creates two very different relationships to reality. And when those two perspectives collide later in life, it feels like madness to both sides. One feels unfairly constrained. The other feels unfairly exploited. You've seen this play out in real time, even if you didn't have language for it. You've watched men rush to defend someone simply because they found them attractive. You've watched accountability disappear in the presence of desire. You've watched logic lose to emotion because someone cried convincingly enough. You've watched social rules bend for the sake of comfort. And if you're honest, you've probably participated in it at some point too. Most men have. Not because they're evil, but because they wanted access. And access came at the cost of honesty. That's the part nobody likes to admit. A lot of the delusion you complain about was co-created. Men rewarded behavior they should have corrected. They defended actions they knew were wrong. They laughed at jokes that weren't funny. They excused disrespect because they hoped it would pay off later. They put themselves in harm's way to gain approval. And when that happens enough times, over enough years, it creates a feedback loop that teaches someone they're untouchable. Not because they're superior, but because they're insulated. Once you see that, the anger dissolves. You stop asking why someone doesn't appreciate what you do for them. You stop being shocked when generosity is met with entitlement. You stop being surprised when reality eventually crashes into fantasy. You understand that appreciation requires contrast. Humility requires correction. Gratitude requires loss. And when someone grows up without those experiences, you can't expect them to suddenly develop those traits later just because circumstances changed. This is where the Machiavellian lens matters, not to excuse behavior, but to predict it. If you remove consequences and increase reward, behavior intensifies. If you add accountability and reduce insulation, behavior moderates. This applies everywhere. Relationships are no exception. When someone's value in the marketplace declines over time, not because they're bad, but because attention shifts elsewhere, reality finally introduces friction. And for someone who's never built internal restraint, that friction feels like injustice instead of correction. You've probably noticed this shift in real life. The moment when someone who was once celebrated starts feeling ignored. The confusion, the bitterness, the sudden demand for real connection after years of dismissing it. The claim that they deserve what they never cultivated. That moment isn't tragic. It's predictable. It's what happens when identity is built on external validation instead of internal character. When the validation fades, there's nothing underneath to stabilize the person. Men don't get better with time by default. They get better because time forces accountability. You don't age into value magically. You age into it if you build something while no one is clapping, if you accept correction, if you endure failure, if you develop discipline when nobody cares. That process is uncomfortable, but it creates depth. And depth ages well. Attention without depth does not. If this sounds harsh, it's because it's unsentimental, not hateful, not gleeful, just clear. You don't need to demonize anyone to understand how incentives shape behavior. You don't need to moralize to predict outcomes. You just need to observe honestly and stop pretending feelings override structure. They don't. Structure always wins in the end. If you're listening to this and feeling a strange mix of relief and discomfort, that's a good sign. Relief because something finally makes sense. Discomfort because it forces you to look at your own role in the system. If this chapter is helping you see patterns instead of villains, like the video, not to agree with me, but to acknowledge that clarity matters more than comfort. Stay with me because the next chapter shifts inward and asks the harder question. What does this understanding require from you now that you can't unsee it? Chapter 2. Once you see how incentives shape people, you can't go back to pretending that everything is about intentions. That's the shift that quietly rearranges how you move through the world. You stop asking whether someone meant well and start asking what their environment trained them to expect. You stop arguing with outcomes and start tracing inputs. And what's unsettling is how clean the lines become once you allow yourself to see them without sentiment clouding the view. This is the moment where most men feel an internal resistance rise up because it feels colder than the stories they were raised on. You were taught that people are good at heart, that love fixes flaws, that patience softens rough edges, that understanding changes behavior. And sometimes, in narrow cases, it does. But on a larger scale, behavior changes when incentives change, not when emotions are explained. That's not pessimism. That's pattern recognition. You don't need to hate anyone to accept it. You just need to be willing to stop lying to yourself about how often reality contradicts the fairy tale. You begin to notice how early conditioning hardens into expectation. When someone grows up in an environment where mistakes are cushioned and accountability is optional, correction feels like an attack later in life. Not because the correction is harsh, but because it's unfamiliar. The nervous system never learned how to metabolize friction. So when friction finally appears, the response isn't reflection. It's outrage, confusion, a sense of injustice. You see this in how certain people react to boundaries, how quickly they escalate, how personally they take limits. Limits feel cruel when you were never taught they're normal. What makes this even more destabilizing is that the system doesn't announce itself. No one sits down and says, "We're going to raise you without consequence." It happens subtly, through tone, through who gets defended, through who gets corrected and who gets comforted, through who's told to toughen up and who's told to be understood. Over time, those small differences compound into radically different relationships with responsibility. And once those relationships are set, trying to reason your way out of them later rarely works. You've probably experienced the moment where you tried to hold someone accountable and watched the conversation collapse instantly. Not because your point was wrong, but because the act of accountability itself felt offensive to them. The discussion stopped being about what happened and turned into how they felt about being questioned. And if you didn't understand incentives yet, you might have thought you were the problem, that you were being too harsh, too rigid, too cold. But what you were actually witnessing was someone encountering a demand their system was never designed to meet. This is where men either wake up or get stuck. The men who get stuck keep trying to negotiate accountability through emotion. They explain, they reassure, they soften, they compromise themselves into confusion. They think if they phrase it better, if they're kinder, if they're more patient, the other person will suddenly respond like someone who is trained differently. And when that doesn't happen, they feel betrayed, not realizing they were asking a person to act outside the boundaries of their conditioning. The men who wake up don't become cruel. They become realistic. They stop trying to extract character where none was cultivated. They stop expecting gratitude from people who were never taught scarcity. They stop demanding humility from people who were raised on exception. That doesn't make them superior. It makes them aligned with reality. And alignment with reality feels like peace compared to the constant friction of denial. This is also where you start seeing your own complicity. That's the part most people want to skip. You realize how often you rewarded behavior you shouldn't have, how often you stayed silent to keep access, how often you defended what you knew was wrong because confrontation felt costly. You see how many small concessions you made that trained others how to treat you. Not because you were weak, but because you were hoping generosity would be returned in kind. That hope is expensive when it's misplaced. There's a quiet reckoning that happens here. You stop casting yourself as the victim and start seeing yourself as a participant in a system that benefited certain behaviors and punished others. You recognize that men, collectively, reinforced dynamics they now complain about. They overvalued appearance. They excused disrespect. They competed for attention instead of withholding it. They laughed when they should have corrected. They stepped in when they should have stepped back. And systems don't care about intentions. They care about outcomes. The outcome was predictable, even if no one wanted to say it out loud at the time. Once you accept that, your posture changes. You're no longer reactive. You're not trying to fix the world or save anyone from themselves. You're simply adjusting how you engage. You stop rewarding entitlement. You stop overgiving where appreciation is absent. You stop explaining boundaries to people who treat boundaries like insults. You don't announce these changes. You just move differently. And that difference is felt immediately by people who were accustomed to getting more than they earned. This is where the Machiavellian lens sharpens, not to make you manipulative, but to make you accurate. Machiavelli wasn't advocating cruelty. He was warning against naivety. He understood that systems shape people more reliably than ideals do. And when you ignore that, you don't become virtuous. You become vulnerable. Vulnerable to being exploited. Vulnerable to being confused. Vulnerable to repeating the same patterns with different faces while telling yourself this time will be different. You start noticing how time corrects imbalances eventually, but never gently. When attention fades, when options narrow, when insulation wears thin, reality shows up uninvited. And for someone who built their identity on constant validation, that moment is destabilizing. Not because they lost value, but because they never learned how to generate it internally. Meanwhile, men who spent years building under pressure without applause find that time works in their favor, not magically, structurally. They developed skills, discipline, and perspective precisely because nobody gave them a pass early on. This isn't triumphal. It's not celebratory. It's sobering. You don't feel joy watching someone collide with reality late. You feel recognition. You've seen it before. You know how it ends. And instead of gloating, you quietly make sure you're not standing in the blast radius when it happens. That's not coldness. That's wisdom earned by watching enough cycles complete themselves. You may be noticing that this understanding doesn't make you more emotional. It makes you quieter. You argue less. You explain less. You expect less from people who haven't earned expectation. And you invest more carefully where behavior demonstrates stability. Your standards don't become harsher, they become clearer. And clarity reduces resentment because you stop asking people to be who they've never shown themselves capable of being. If you're listening and feeling a subtle shift in how you interpret past interactions, that's the point. Not to rewrite history angrily, but to read it accurately. Accuracy gives you leverage over your future choices. It helps you avoid confusing kindness with wisdom and tolerance with strength. It helps you understand that compassion doesn't require self-sacrifice and that realism doesn't require cruelty. Those false binaries keep men stuck longer than they need to be. This chapter isn't about judging anyone. It's about accepting that environments shape outcomes more reliably than intentions do. And once you accept that, you stop being surprised by behavior that used to feel shocking. You stop taking it personally. You stop internalizing it. You simply adjust where you place your time, energy, and attention. And that adjustment, quiet as it is, changes everything downstream. If this chapter is forcing you to reconsider how much responsibility you give feelings versus structure, pause for a second and like the video. Not as agreement, but as recognition. Recognition that seeing clearly is uncomfortable at first, but cheaper than learning the same lesson repeatedly through loss. Stay with me, because the next chapter turns this lens inward and asks what kind of man thrives once he stops fighting incentives and starts positioning himself intelligently within them. Chapter 3. Once you stop fighting incentives and start positioning yourself within them, something subtle happens to your identity. You stop needing to announce what you are. You stop trying to convince anyone of anything. The hunger to be understood fades because you're no longer building your sense of self off external approval. You're operating from alignment instead of aspiration, and alignment doesn't need witnesses to feel real. This is where most men finally slow down. Not because they're tired, but because speed stops being necessary. When you're chasing validation, everything feels urgent. You rush decisions, you overextend, you over-explain, you stay longer than you should. You tolerate confusion because clarity feels like it might cost you access. But when you understand incentives, urgency disappears. You realize nothing valuable needs to be rushed. Anything real can survive a pause. Anything fragile usually can't. You start recognizing how much of your earlier effort wasn't about connection at all. It was about positioning yourself to be chosen, to be approved, to be seen as worthy by someone whose standards you didn't actually respect. That realization stings at first, not because it makes you feel weak, but because it exposes how often you outsourced your self-assessment. You let someone else's interest determine your value. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You don't hate your past self. You understand him. He didn't know better yet. This is where the Machiavellian clarity turns inward instead of outward. You stop analyzing others so much and start analyzing your own patterns. Why you gave when you weren't appreciated. Why you defended behavior that made you uneasy. Why you kept hoping people would grow in directions they never indicated they were interested in growing. The answer isn't stupidity. It's conditioning. You were taught that patience is virtuous, that sacrifice proves love, that tolerance signals strength. Those ideas aren't wrong in the right context. They're disastrous in the wrong one. The context that breaks men is asymmetric incentive. When one side benefits regardless of behavior and the other side pays regardless of outcome, resentment is inevitable. And resentment doesn't always show up as anger. Sometimes it shows up as exhaustion, as numbness, as disengagement, as a quiet sense that something is off but you can't quite name it. That feeling isn't intuition failing you. It's intuition trying to speak in an environment where honesty felt risky. Once you understand this, you stop framing boundaries as ultimatums. They become defaults. You're no longer drawing lines dramatically. You're simply living in a way that makes certain behaviors incompatible with your presence. That's a massive shift. It means you don't need to argue about respect. You just withdraw access when it's absent. You don't need to demand appreciation. You just stop investing where it's missing. And because there's no performance attached to it, the move feels clean instead of punitive. You might notice that people react differently to you now. Some feel unsettled, not because you're doing anything aggressive, but because they can't read you the way they used to. They're accustomed to emotional cues they can respond to: excitement, eagerness, anxiety. When those cues disappear, they lose leverage. And people who are used to leverage interpret its absence as distance or arrogance. Let them. You don't correct perceptions that don't affect your alignment. This is also where attraction starts to invert. Instead of chasing interest, you become selective about it. Not picky in a superficial way, but attentive. You notice how someone handles disappointment, how they respond when they don't get immediate gratification, how they speak about people who aren't present, how they treat generosity when it's not guaranteed. Those details matter more than charm ever did. And once you start filtering for them, the noise drops dramatically. What's interesting is that this posture doesn't make you isolated. It makes your connections fewer but deeper, less volatile, more mutual. You're no longer in relationships where you feel like you're constantly proving something. You're in relationships where effort flows both ways without negotiation. That balance doesn't feel exciting at first if you're used to chaos. It feels almost boring. But that boredom is peace in disguise. It's your nervous system learning a new baseline. You also become more honest with yourself about desire. You stop pretending you want people who don't treat you well. You stop romanticizing indifference. You stop chasing validation from those who withhold it. You realize how much of what you called attraction was actually a craving for approval. And once approval stops being scarce internally, it stops being magnetic externally. You're not repelled by confidence. You're no longer drawn to resistance for its own sake. This is where your standards solidify naturally, not because you wrote them down, but because your tolerance changed. You don't tolerate chaos because it disrupts your peace. You don't tolerate disrespect because it signals future instability. You don't tolerate entitlement because it predicts resentment later. None of this requires explanation. It just requires consistency. And consistency is something men understand deeply once they stop confusing intensity with meaning. There's a quiet power in being unsurprised, not cynical, just unsurprised. You see behavior and you know where it leads. You don't dramatize it. You don't argue with it. You simply decide whether you want to be present for the outcome. That's what Machiavellian thinking really is at its core. Not manipulation, but foresight. Seeing the end of the pattern before it completes and choosing accordingly. You might feel a strange sense of grief here too. Grief for the belief that goodness alone should have been enough, that fairness would be reciprocated, that effort would be appreciated automatically. Let that grief exist. It's part of maturing. Maturity isn't about becoming harder. It's about becoming clearer. Clear about what you can influence and what you can't. Clear about where to invest and where to step back. Clear about who you are when no one is watching or validating you. This clarity changes how you view time. You stop rushing outcomes because you understand compounding. Small, consistent decisions outweigh dramatic gestures. Quiet discipline outperforms loud intention. Character built slowly under pressure lasts longer than reputation built quickly through attention. And once you see time as an ally instead of an enemy, you stop panicking about missing out. You're not missing anything meant for you by moving deliberately. You also become less reactive to cultural narratives. You don't need to agree or disagree loudly. You don't need to posture. You don't need to perform outrage or alignment. You understand that narratives exist to mobilize emotion, not to describe reality accurately. Reality doesn't need slogans. It just unfolds. And men who can sit with that unfoldment without needing to control it gain an enormous advantage. They see trends before they become obvious. They adjust before pain forces the adjustment. If this chapter feels quieter than the others, that's intentional. This stage isn't dramatic. It's stabilizing. It's where men stop oscillating between hope and disappointment and start building a life that doesn't require constant emotional negotiation. You're not closed off. You're open selectively. You're not detached. You're grounded. You're no longer reactive to incentives that used to pull you off center because you've built an internal structure strong enough to hold your direction steady. This is the man who benefits from time instead of fearing it. The man who doesn't need early wins because he understands long games. The man who doesn't resent others for their advantages because he's focused on optimizing his own position. That focus isn't selfish, it's responsible. It's what allows you to show up with integrity where it matters instead of being drained everywhere else. If you're listening to this and realizing how much lighter your decisions feel when you stop negotiating with delusion, that's not coincidence. That's alignment. And alignment is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It just makes your life easier to live. If this chapter helped you see how positioning replaces resentment, like the video, not because it flatters you, but because it reinforces clarity. The next chapter pulls this all the way forward and asks the final question. What kind of future does this way of thinking actually create when lived consistently over time? Chapter 4. When this way of thinking is lived long enough, The future it creates doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly, almost anticlimactically. And that's how you know it's real. You wake up one day and realize your life feels easier to manage, not because it's perfect, but because it's coherent. The people around you make sense. Your decisions don't fight each other. Your values don't contradict your actions. There's no constant emotional cleanup required after every interaction. The chaos that used to feel inevitable is gone, not because the world changed, but because you stopped placing yourself in the middle of incentives that were designed to drain you. This is the part nobody sells because it doesn't sound sexy. There's no dramatic redemption arc, no moment where everyone realizes you were right all along, no applause, just stability, just momentum, just a sense that time is finally working with you instead of against you. And once you taste that, you realize how much energy you used to spend surviving dynamics that never had your long-term interest in mind. You didn't lose those years. You paid tuition. And now you're no longer enrolled in lessons you already passed. Your relationships start reflecting this immediately, not because you demand more, but because you accept less confusion. You don't entertain emotional theater. You don't chase intensity. You don't mistake attention for alignment. And that changes who sticks around. People who thrived on ambiguity fade out. People who relied on leverage lose interest. What's left are individuals who can meet you where you are without trying to bend reality to their advantage. That's not luck. That's selection finally working in your favor because you stop sabotaging it. You notice the same effect in your work, your friendships, your habits. You stop overcommitting. You stop explaining yourself unnecessarily. You stop justifying decisions to people who aren't affected by them. You move deliberately. You think longer term. You choose fewer things and execute them better. And because you're no longer emotionally fragmented, your focus sharpens. Focus compounds faster than talent ever did. Consistency outpaces motivation every time. And now you're operating from a place that makes consistency possible. What surprises most men at this stage is how little resentment they feel. They expected clarity to make them bitter. Instead, it makes them neutral. You don't hate people for being who they are. You don't argue with incentives anymore. You understand them. You account for them. You adjust. That understanding dissolves anger because anger usually comes from violated expectations. When your expectations are realistic, violations stop feeling personal. They become information. Information is useful. Personalization is expensive. You also stop needing villains. You don't need to frame anyone as evil to justify your distance. You don't need to demonize to disengage. You simply recognize incompatibility and move accordingly. That's maturity. It's quieter than outrage, but far more powerful. Outrage keeps you entangled. Clarity lets you walk away clean. And clean exits preserve your energy for things that actually build your life forward. Over time, this way of moving changes how you see yourself. You trust your judgment again, not because you're infallible, but because you know you're no longer lying to yourself to maintain access. You don't override your instincts for approval. You don't negotiate your boundaries for hope. When something feels off, you don't rush to explain it away. You pause. You observe. You let the pattern reveal itself. That trust in your own perception is worth more than any validation you use to chase. This is where aging stops being something men fear. Time stops feeling like a countdown and starts feeling like an asset. Each year adds leverage because you're stacking clarity instead of baggage. You're not carrying unresolved resentment forward. You're not repeating the same mistakes with different faces. You're building on lessons instead of reliving them. That's why men who reach this stage often seem calmer, more grounded, less reactive. It's not because life got easier. It's because they stopped making it harder by fighting reality. You might notice that you attract less drama and more substance now. Conversations feel simpler, expectations are clearer, effort is mutual, That doesn't mean everything is smooth. Conflict still happens. Disappointment still exists. But it doesn't destabilize you. It doesn't spiral. It doesn't hijack your sense of self. You handle it, adjust, and keep moving. That steadiness is what allows you to build something lasting instead of constantly starting over. There's also a subtle shift in how you experience desire. You're no longer drawn to people who create tension just to feel something. You're drawn to those who add to your life rather than complicate it. That doesn't mean you avoid challenge. It means you avoid chaos disguised as passion. You've learned the difference, and once you've learned it, your nervous system won't let you unlearn it. Peace becomes attractive. Consistency becomes sexy. Reliability becomes rare in a world addicted to stimulation. Looking back, you might feel compassion for the version of yourself that didn't know any of this yet. The one who thought intensity meant importance. The one who believed patience would be rewarded automatically. The one who kept giving, hoping someone would eventually become grateful. That version wasn't foolish. He was operating with the information he had. What matters is that you didn't stay there. You adapted. You learned. You adjusted your strategy instead of blaming the game. This is what thinking clearly actually buys you. Not dominance, not superiority, not control over others. Control over yourself. Control over where your time goes. Control over what you tolerate. Control over which incentives you participate in. And that control compounds quietly into a life that feels intentional instead of reactive. You're no longer trying to win arguments you don't need to be in. You're building outcomes that don't require explanation. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself somewhere along this path, sit with that recognition. It means you're closer to alignment than you think. If this video helped you articulate a shift you've already been feeling but hadn't fully named yet, like it. Not for me, but because acknowledging clarity reinforces it. And if you want to keep developing this kind of perspective, subscribe. Not for constant content, but for continuity. Because once you stop fighting incentives and start positioning yourself intelligently, life doesn't get louder, it gets quieter. And in that quiet, you finally have the space to build something that lasts.